4, 6. I just read that. And 7. Look at this. It is not that the present and the past lack interest or amusement. It is not that the present and the past lack interest or amusement. It was on purpose, but it kind of freaked me out when I was deciding to read chapter 7 today. And it actually starts exactly the same. That's why I lost track last time. Also, testing to see whether it's facing the right way. That should say chapter 7.
When I was younger, I chased butterflies. Now I look around and realize there ain't no butterflies around here no more. Some people everywhere in a crowd that once was there. Then their time goes into pinball. And on streets I walked.
Book 1, Chapter 7. It is not that the present and the past lack interest or amusement. It is not the feeling of regret, but it seems inconceivable that you would allow these slight touches to define the way you move about the world today. Why do the memories of minor characters like Errol and Eggert, that's Aaron and Jeff Ott, for instance, seem somehow important? Their raw, gritty, melodic music and odd personalities helped alter the already rapidly changing world for you. Errol and Eggert once stayed at your house. This house was in no way a punk house. It was your mother's home, a nice, comfortable 2-story, 3-bedroom house in Chicago's northwest suburbs. 2/3 of Swindle Parlor stayed there for 2 weeks, awaiting the arrival of a new bass player. While on their first major tour across a country that hardly cared whether they lived or died, played or stayed silent, their bass player up and left unbeknownst to the rest of Swindle Parlor. He snuck out in the middle of the night, drove the van out of Florida and back home to California. He left Errol and Eggert stranded with only 2 sleeping bags, a few assorted drums and cymbals, 1 guitar, and a mysterious small shoebox that no one but Eggert was allowed to touch. To get a more accurate, this of course is supposed to be fiction, but a lot of it is true. But to get a more accurate picture of this, I actually did a Jughead's Basement podcast on Crimpshrine where they talked extensively about this tour. So that is actually a better reference if you want more of the actual events of Crimpshrine during that time. They called your house looking for Mr. Famous. Within a few hours, Mr. Famous pulled together enough gas money to drive to Florida and back. His car was temporarily useless and in need of 4 new tires, a battery that wasn't corroded, and a new alternator. Another mode of transportation would have to be borrowed. Mr. Famous convinced a mutual friend, who was referred to as Skunk, to drive 12 hours with him to pick up the 2 tall, unbathed, tattered bookends, and then immediately turn right around and drive 12 hours back to Chicago. Skunk said, "Sure." He was a man who exuded very little energy, and even fewer words. Skunk was given the nickname before he moved to Chicago. It was given to him not because of his pungency, but because of the natural white stripe through his jet-black hair. Skunk owned a black Trans Am. It was loud, rusty, and uncomfortable, but reliable. Well, it was mostly reliable. Actually, no one thought they would make it back. It was quite a stupefying expedition. Because of your 2 jobs and the lack of room in the Trans Am, you were not able to partake in the woes and wonders of this particular trip. But this favorable sacrifice was more than made up for by letting Errol and Eggert stay at your house for 2 sleepless, disturbingly pungent weeks. They brought fleas, black bugs, and hairy brown spiders into your basement bedroom. It is unknown to this very day whether Swindle Parlor imported these unwelcome house guests with their own bodies as hosts, or if the indigenous insects of your neighborhood just happened to be attracted to some aspect of their foreign characteristics. A while after the band left, you opened a curtain to get some air. The forest pulled apart a small cocoon-like egg. 1,000 woolly brown baby wolf spiders quickly leaped into the wolf spiders quickly leaped into and attacked the room like an evil, hairy infantry. Each one of the 1,000 used to newly birthed 8 tiny... Each one of the 1,000 used its newly birthed 8 tiny disgusting legs to scurry in every direction possible. The only thing that prevented you from lashing out in a fear-driven anger, thrash the air, destroy all material goods within a 15-foot radius, and burn the place to the ground, was a hope that these arachnids might gulp up all the other insects Swindlepile had left behind. Do you know for sure if Errol and Eggert were the motivation for the arachnid infiltration? No, but it makes their stay somehow mystical, symbolic, significant, possibly even biblical. It does seem feasible, since they never bathed, feasible as the forebringers of insects, not as biblical figures, although most biblical figures probably smelled pretty rank, but who could tell, when everyone else smelled just as bad or even worse. Their sleeping bags were filthy, their pillows were ripped and full of unstuffed canals that made perfect houses for critters in hiding. Eggert carried that taped-up old shoebox covered with smudged fingerprints. For a while during their stay, you thought he may have been breeding the bugs, occasionally reaching into his sealed box and painstakingly placing pregnant cockroaches and ticks under ashtrays on top of bookshelves and inside album sleeves. The shoebox had crooked tally marks haphazardly scratched into its panels. That's how he would have been keeping track of the homes he had infected with the black bug plague. How inexplicable these two seem to be. Where are they now? Oh, by the way, in his box he actually carried books. He was a big fan of, I can't remember his name now. It's not Harold Ramis, but I'll put it in the comments because I thought it was really interesting. Where are they now? You haven't a clue. Why don't you know? There are some friends that you could ask about the current whereabouts of Errol and Eggert, and they would have an answer. But why don't you know now? You know they don't work together anymore, or at least you think they don't. They had a falling out. Someone got hurt, or maybe not. One of them did something horrible. Or was it that one of them finked on somebody perceived as committing something immoral, something horrible? Was it something hypocritical? What does that matter? You have a hard enough time in your own head. Don't question the vague unless it makes it less vague. Perhaps you would remember these things if you had committed to a strong opinion. Of what? Of anything. Of everything. It seems the people who remember the most are the ones who have committed to an opinion, a decision about what is right and what is wrong. Does that make it true? You don't know. That is one of the reasons you are the way you are. That is why you can't remember if Eggert or Errol did something horrible. It really wouldn't take much time to find out what they are doing now. They are still out there walking the streets of this world. Do they ever think about you while they pursue their art? While writing their books or creating their songs? Once again, this can also be answered in the podcast, because I finally did track them all down and interviewed them. I think part of this had always been in the back of my mind from this book, about wondering where they were, and when I decided to do the podcast, they were definitely one of the top 5 that I wanted to get done. It's often very easy not making an impression. The sky aims a specific drop of water at your eye, and it hits the mark, making an amazing right-angle mid-air turn from sky to eye. It stings for a moment, then you notice that you have been staring blankly at the man with a newspaper for a hat. Now you are just staring and rubbing your eye. He is listening to the music through the glass. He does not stare back at you. He is completely unaware, unaffected by your impolite gaze. If only you could get his attention without moving or saying anything, with only thoughts. If you could do this, he would look in your direction, and you would know that you are present. There isn't anything special about his eyes staring at you. There isn't anything special about anyone's eyes staring directly at you. It only acknowledges. But what does it acknowledge? An existence? A moment in time? A connection? A miscommunication? A passage to somewhere else? I ask a lot of questions, philosophical questions in this book. Mr. Famous opens the door of the Trans Am. It swings outward, pulling the car to the right. The rusty hinges grinding against rusty pegs. A soft metallic powder falls onto your driveway. Eggert steps out from the back seat. His bare toes press against the concrete. His body reaches upward toward the afternoon sun, and his shape all but vanishes when he puts his hands above his head to complete a stretch, as if he were a two-dimensional man turned sideways. He spots you standing at the front door. He smiles. He begins to walk toward you, and you decide to meet him halfway. "Hello, JJ. Did you leave your shoes in the van?" Not too nice of him leaving you stranded like that. You look down at his calloused heels and dirty toenails. There's a smiley face tattooed on the small toe. It stares up at you, a friendly little oddity. "Do you need some shoes?" He shakes your hand. "I have some shoes inside the house if you need a pair. I have some moccasins my father brought back for me from the Wisconsin dells. They're too big. Can't hunt buffalo if your shoes fall off every other step." "I don't wear shoes." "Yes, I must have forgotten." Pause. In mid-shake, there is a pause. All handshakes are partly uncomfortable these days, especially in the music biz. It seems too corporate, and yet you still use the handshake. However, it does seem as if the handshake is slowly disappearing from the world, or at least in your small part of the world. This may be why the handshake is uncomfortable. It no longer fits properly. It must be done away with for good. It will be a better place, unless the handshake is not replaced with some other sort of first-person contact. The world needs a greeting that hasn't become sterile, official, and meaningless. Something absurdly shocking like the rubbing of elbows, or heads softly knocking together. A new greeting, a contact that freshly acknowledges to the parties involved that two bodies are occupying one space. Even the closeness of the Sicilian-born kissing of the cheeks is more often than not impersonal kisses blown past the cheek, into the air, lost floating through the atmosphere. This also is a reference to, I talk about things being in two places at once. This sort of idea of touching also has that resonance with me. In mid-shake, there is still the remnants of a pause, and then, "Hello, Eggert. How are you?" "Tired. Thank you for letting us stay at your house. Do you have any coffee?" Everyone from the East Bay drinks coffee, black coffee, thick and plentiful. Yet most of them walk the earth in a sort of calm haze, as if their atoms are provoked to move so quickly that their bodies must move slowly in order to prevent their matter from unhinging and spiraling off into space. That's true. Back then, even still now, like Jesse Michaels and Jeff Ott and Aaron and even Jake, they all had this sort of low tone where they just sort of talked a little bit like they were monotone. It's very interesting. "Wouldn't you rather take a nap?" "No, I'm pretty sure coffee is what I need." "We don't have coffee in the house at the moment. My mother and Franklin are the only ones who drink coffee in the house, and my mother is staying somewhere else for a while, dog-sitting, and Franklin drinks his at the gas station. I work at the coffee shop tomorrow. I can bring some back tomorrow night for you, but I can't do anything about it now." Eggert is saddened by this information. He walks back to the car. Errol is reaching into the back seat, pulling out his backpack. It is a small backpack, one of those made for pencils and paper and a few books and one or two pairs of underwear. Errol and Eggert exchange a few words. Errol reaches into the front pocket of his plaid polyester home-cut shorts, pulls out a few bucks, and hands them to Eggert. Eggert puts the money in a partially ripped back pocket of his garbage-picked hand-me-down jeans. He looks first to the right, down your street, and then to the left. Down the other direction of your street, and then straight ahead, across your neighbor's lawn on the other side of your street. And then, as if with some spontaneous eliminative systemology, he chooses to walk to the right. That actually did happen. I remember that. Mr. Famous and Errol are engaged in some conversation or another that is only slightly interrupted by the money exchange with Eggert. Errol frees his backpack from the random pieces of luggage, musical equipment, fast food sacks, and cups. He opens it and gives Mr. Famous a handmade booklet. Mr. Famous says something like, "Yes, I heard about this one." They walk right by you on the way into the house. Errol looks back. "Hey, JJ." "Hey, Errol. Where's Eggert headed?" "He went for coffee." "Does he know where to go?" "Didn't you tell him?" "No." "Then I guess he doesn't." Mr. Famous, without looking up from the booklet, says, "Sounds like he's headed for trouble." And of course, you have to add, "and without shoes, to boot." And Errol answers with such a straight face that you don't know if he finds any of this humorous. He doesn't wear shoes. Maybe he's playing with some sort of West Coast irony by acting serious in a humorous conversation. It seems awfully similar to your Chicago-based sarcasm, but there isn't enough of a grin or a subtle smirk. Sometimes you just don't understand these Northern California folk. It doesn't help that a large percentage of the California inhabitants are originally from someplace else. It's a hodgepodge of intellects, mannerisms, drug-induced eccentricities, musicians, and actors. That's what I hear. You couldn't tell by looking at him. It can't be too hard to find a place. Errol is partially correct. It can't be too hard, but it's not too easy, and it's not too close. This is the Midwestern suburbs, and the closest stores are about 2.5 miles away. So it's not too far, but that's only when heading in the right direction. One wrong turn and he'll be on Eastman Avenue, a street that looks exactly like this one. Eastman leads to another identical street called Greenwood, which in turn leads to a cul-de-sac that looks nothing like your street except for the identical houses with similar earthy shades of brown and green aluminum siding. And after circling the cul-de-sac, he has a 50-50 chance of heading in the right direction. It is possible that Eggert has the kind of mind that figures to walk backward is to walk forward, and if he chooses to adhere to this logic, he may succeed in finding coffee before dusk. Where's Skunk? He's in the car. Errol and Mr. Famous continue their conversation. They enter the front door. The screen shuts behind them. From the sidewalk, you can see that the driver's door is wide open, but you can't see Skunk. He is 6.5 feet tall, and his mohawk adds another foot or two to his height. You should be able to see him. You walk over to the car and stare through the passenger's window. He is slumped over the front seat, fast asleep with one foot out the door, planted firmly on the ground, ready for action, ready to dream. The key alarm buzzing. His cigarette is smoldering. You walk to the other side of the car, pick up his combat-booted foot, aim it toward the window, shut the door, and rest it half in, half out the open window. You reach for his other foot and set them beside each other. You take the cigarette from his fingers and stick it in the ashtray. Skunk is a hero, for a day. And for his reward, he gets to sleep under the hot, humid-inducing, summer, sun-cramped in the front seat of his black vinyl interior, road-weary Trans Am. End of Chapter 7. Thank you. Cool. That was an easy read. Okay, the only addendum I have is the books. I don't know if it's mentioned later in the novel, but I might get it wrong. But the novelist was Tom Robbins that Jeff Ott carried with him. I think it was either Still Life with Woodpeckers or Jitterbug Perfume or a couple of those. He might even have had the Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe in that little box too. I seem to recall that, but I'm not sure. But I do remember it was Tom Robbins in one of his books, or a couple of his books. And also, I wanted to say too that the streets that I give around my house were actually the streets around my house. I lived in Mount Prospect, right by Rancher Cinema, and I lived on Highland, which I wrote a song with Even in Blackouts called 517 East Highland. None of our family lives there anymore, but I lived there till I was about 23. So that's it. Thank you. End of addendum. End of addendum.